Okay, welcome to the OneX Podcast. This is a podcast that I'm going to do to document my journey of trying to change design and housing in the world. I know that's a crazy idea, but I think that I can make a real difference, and I'd like to document my journey. And I think this will be a good learning process, and I believe we can have some good interviews, talk about housing, design, business, because all those things are needed to achieve the goal that we need to get to, which is modular housing. Pretty much manufacturing housing is my goal to get to the goal of great design in all housing, in everybody's house. Let's say that's maybe a better way to put it. Great design in everyone's home, accessible to everybody. And you need to be able to manufacture it. Like, you need to be able to make, kind of like Ford, the Ford car company allowed cars to become widely accessible. I'd like to make great design widely accessible. And well, his answer for that was building the moving assembly line. So we need to book the moving assembly line for housing, basically, because housing is the main design you spend the most time around. Anyway, let's get into the first topic of this podcast. So OneX, why did I choose OneX for this podcast? Names, I think they do matter, and the symbols, I think, matter. So I think having a name with meaning is actually important. It's a good design, after all. So I chose OneX because it's the same name as my business and my gamer tag from when I was like 12. So I came up with the name when I was setting up an account for an online game. I think it was like a space game where you like dogfight in spaceships. Pretty cool game. I think it was called Starfighter. So if you're interested in space combat games, it's kind of interesting. I think they have a new version out. Nothing advanced. It's pretty basic Flash. It was originally a Flash game, so it's pretty simple. Anyway, the name I came up with, I was like 12, and I was trying to come up. Maybe I was 13. No, I was not in high school yet. So I wanted a cool name because, when you're making an online game, you want to have a cool name. So I was like, I heard, for some reason, I don't know how, but I found out that mono meant one. I'm not totally sure how I found out that mono meant one at 12 years old. I must have seen it somewhere, reading something. But or maybe I was looking up one. Maybe that's what it was. I probably looked like, okay, I want to be number one. I probably, researched synonyms for number one on Google or something, and found out that mono was number one. So I made the name Mono, and then obviously just add an X because X's are cool. And also mono was obviously taken because it's too simple of a name. So I was like, okay, Mono X. There you go. Now we got a cool name. And I think in the game, I couldn't just use Mono X. I had to add like another M because somebody had already taken that one, as one does. So I had like Monex. Anyway, so OneX, because we can name whatever we want here, or we don't have to, not copy a name here for the podcast. We can actually call it the original name, which would have been OneX. And why stick with a name from when I was 12? Well, because OneX, I think, actually is a kind of cool name, but also meaningful name in the sense that I think all creativity and design comes from one kind of truth. I do believe, when I'm talking to, some background, I host meetups on meetup.com. And one of my meetups that I host is a meditation discussion event. It's basically my excuse to meet interesting people who want to talk about deep topics, and we do a meditation because just to kind of center the conversation. I keep hitting my mic. That's rather annoying. Anyway, just center the conversation in a rooted self or grounded perspective, as opposed to a discussion can often become very cultural, societal, and just off the wall, talking about big topics that don't matter for you. Really, I think the only thing that matters is what you can do to change things. There's not much point in talking about something you can't have an effect on. So meditation really helps you get grounded back into what yourself and what you can do, and keeps the conversation grounded from a personal perspective. So actually on this podcast, I would like to you're not going to see it as the guest, but I'm going to do a 10-minute meditation before I do every podcast. And if I have guests on, I will be having them do the meditation as well, or prayer if they're Christian, either way, to help center the conversation into the topic and ground it into themselves. So that's something that's important for the podcast. And OneX, again, going back to truth, is often a discussion that comes up, which is there a single truth, or is there not a single truth? I believe there is a single truth. I have heard from probably another podcast with a scientist, I don't remember their name, who was talking about how we all actually see the world from a different set of eyes. And so we are actually seeing the world differently. And there's also no reason that what we see is supposed to be what is real. Because our eyes are just sensors that are trying to detect information, and then our brain has to take that information, turn it into something, and that thing being reality is highly unlikely, if not a 0% chance, maybe a 0.01% chance. It's almost impossible that what we see is actually reality or truth. But that doesn't mean that there's not a truth. And I think that we're all sensing something that obviously does exist. You can feel the stuff. It literally stops you. Physical objects can stop you from moving them. And so it does seem to me to be a truth with actual things in it. And the more we can understand about truth, the better we can serve ourselves. And also, as far as creative tasks are concerned, the better we understand truth, the better we can be creative. And really, creative artwork or creative designs or anything that is creative that we make is truly great when it can it is recognized as great when it shares something about that deep truth, that single truth to you, right? That you can't question. When it kind of represents truth into reality, and we see that and we really like that. So that's why I would say art in all its forms has value, is when it shares truth. And that comes back to that one thing, whatever you want to call it, the universe, God, whatever it is, there's a single truth. And that is what all design and creativity comes out of. So obviously this podcast is about design as its kind of core business, and housing out of that. But design is the main focus. And so that single truth of creativity is the thing we need to come back to for us to be successful. So that's why this is OneX. All right. If you have any questions about OneX, I can answer more about that. But let's move on to the next topic. So the next topic is housing. So this podcast, I do want it to be fairly long. I want to talk about the topics until I have nothing left to say about them. Hopefully that'll make it, Raymond, for like an hour or more. I don't know if I can really talk for an hour or more, but we'll see if I can actually do that. And if I have guests on, definitely going to be an hour longer. In my experience, I far prefer podcasts that are over an hour long. So the next topic is housing. So housing, why talk about housing? What does it matter? We touched on this before. Why does housing matter? The house is basically the foundation for a family. It's the foundation for a community. It's the foundation for design. Pretty much you spend most of your life in your house. Basically, you spend most of your time at your house and work. And depending, especially now, with some people moving, some people and some people not, or at least more people moving to remote work, working from home. There's a lot more of that going on. So that even more pushes that the house is something you spend a lot of time in. Historically, we used to spend a lot more time in our home as well, whether in farmers, agricultural communities would, the home and you had your barn and you had your house, right? And you spent all your time on the farm, which had your house and your barn, right? So you spent a lot of time in both locations. And you'd likely spend a lot more time in your house than somebody who works a 9-to-5 job. Maybe not as much as someone who's a remote worker these days, but it is a foundational part where you're going to experience design most often. And it's going to be the place where you invest in design as well for yourself. So those are some main reasons why housing is important. I would say also really relevant to right now. The house is the core, like the foundation for a family. And so the fact that a lot of young people now can't afford to buy a house until at least like their mid-30s really slows family as well, right? Not many people are willing to start a family without being able to afford a house. Personally, a lot of my friends and family will either rent a place or they'll get some kind of RV, mobile home, something more affordable as like a starting point where they can kind of have a house, but not really a full house as kind of traditionally considered. But at least some people are willing to move forward with that. A lot of people are not willing to take that compromise and really would like a full house like their parents had. And right now that's really, for a lot of people, it's just not attainable in their 20s. A lot of people, it's, into your 30s. By the time you're your mid 30s, you're kind of pushing your chance at building a family. Like you still can, but obviously it's going to be different than someone who's starting a family in their 20s, right? So with the loss of housing as an option, attainable option in your people's 20s, it's really putting, I think, a lot of strain on families and communities. Okay, so if that's housing from a kind of family perspective. So housing to me is really important as well from like a societal culture perspective. I know I said I wouldn't talk about society and culture, but we're going to touch on it a little bit. In my opinion, the largest aspect of community disconnect that goes on in our current Canadian culture. I'm Canadian. I live in Ontario, and I think the largest factor of disconnect, maybe the second largest factor, I think it is the largest factor, is our housing preferences. The fact that we have all these sprawling suburbs where people only transit to and from locations using a car. When you're going to and from in a car, you're pretty much always in a confined space where you're safe, which I guess you could say is good because you're safe, but you don't ever have the opportunity to just walk past a neighbor and say hi, right? And at least far less often than older communities where people were more closely connected. And this is happening in both, I would say, like in the space of suburban living, you have a lot of disconnect. People really only maybe know their neighbor, or maybe they'll be lucky. Most people are lucky to even know the direct neighbors, right? And so you also have the same thing in like condos. Like I lived in a condo for a little bit. Nobody talked to each other, right? Everybody kind of kept to themselves. And to me, I think that is actually a part of just a design, is not just that, okay, well, people are all disconnected because they don't like talking to each other. I think, sure, it could be like, some cultures are better at talking to each other. Some cultures are, not so good at connecting with each other, depending on societal norms. And, you could say our societal norms are changing toward people being less friendly with each other. But I also do think it's largely the way we design our homes, where it's very in the past, you built your own home. Your home was yours. You built it or bought it. You joined the community. And the home was built by craftsmen, whether it was you as a craftsman or someone else as a craftsman. And each home was kind of unique, right? And it was built by someone who cared. And the communities were built kind of together by people that cared, and they built them to suit themselves. So when you built your house, you wouldn't just throw a house together. You would be building it, and in the process of taking a year or two to build it, or maybe even longer, depending on what kind of house you're building. It could be several years that you take to build your home. Obviously, if it was a new community, you might have had the community come together to help you build your home so you could have it prepared, before winter, let's say, so you survive winter, which would be a thing. But again, that would be a community building moment where people could come together, meet their neighbors, actually work together with their neighbors, and help form those lasting bonds. Today, we have none of that, right? Nobody is built. Very few people are building their own house, and houses aren't being built by someone who's actually caring or thinking about the person who owns the house. Really, they're just building them as products to be sold. So developers are just looking at it as a commodity, and they're just building a certain amount of this many kind of house in a certain area. They allow you to have personalization so that you feel like you're personalizing it to suit you, but really it's just a commodity that you're putting together. And that's both in suburban living, it's very much a commodity, and entirely like corporate, would, to me, very like exceedingly corporate, right? Where you have a developer. For suburban living to work, you have to have the developer who builds the development, and the Walmart that comes in to provide somewhere to shop, and all the other big box stores, the town to provide the services. In the past, we didn't have any of these things, right? People had to figure it out. You had to set up your own little shops to get stuff to people, and you had to create your own services for, whether it was, you often didn't have electricity, obviously, but even when electricity and other utilities started to become a thing, people would come as a community to put these things together, rather than having a town that not everybody fully understands, especially these days. But young people are often not educated with what towns, municipalities do, and how that affects them when they are living somewhere. So even going to it, like even in condos, you have a lot of disconnection. You'd think, okay, like all these people living in the same building, you'd think they'd have a better connection to each other. The developers often add, services like swimming pools and infrastructure and other stuff into it, which can lead to potentially a little bit more community. But in my experience, when I was living in some condo towers, and people I've talked to who live in condo towers, they don't really have. There's not really a community in these condos, in these apartment buildings. Most condos don't have like shared spaces that are like welcoming. Like, I'd personally have to do obviously some real research into like how you could change a condo to suit people's needs. I would think a few of the main things would be, common areas where kids can play, and then making actual condo areas, like the spaces, large enough to accommodate a family, as well as improving sound as well would be actually important. The insulation, reducing the chance that people will hear each other, would, being able to not hear each other actually benefits you to be like your neighbor more, because then you don't get frustrated with hearing them all the time or occasionally, and then being annoyed that they're annoying and loud. So there's a few things about housing from a societal level is that the current design of housing that developers push really doesn't help connection. Honestly, the commoditization of housing really brings a lot of disconnection for communities. I could go deeper into that, but I think we're far enough on that one. How affordability. So we talked about why affordable housing matters. Affordable housing matters for families. I think it also matters because if we can build housing more affordably, we may be able to allow people to build their own homes more often. Or at least if we can give them, kind of think like a PC. Like you build a PC, you can buy all the components, put it together yourself. And so if we make that easier for you to be able to buy, let's say, modular components that you can put your own house together, then you can have a more of a connection with your house. So the next part is, okay, so why does affordable housing matter? Again, family, society levels, just young people's ability to also have a place of their own and be able to continue to grow. Why is there no affordable housing right now? So there's kind of two main reasons that housing has become unaffordable. It is obviously a pretty vastly complex topic, but I can bring it down to basically two issues from my conversations and kind of studying this over the last like 5 years. So number one, let's say, is industry. So this is where I can actually have an effect and where you can have an effect, is the industry. So we're talking about like Henry Ford and the assembly line. The housing space, the construction space is a very stagnant industry. There is a good reason for it. There's pretty good studies that show that construction is a very risky endeavor. It's very highly risky, as in like up to 30% chance of success with almost 70% chance of failure. So that means that you actually have a lower chance that you'll actually succeed than fail. So there's a higher chance you're going to fail. For the average construction project, that is actually seems to be the case, is that generally they will not meet their budget. There's only a 30% chance they will be hitting their budget. And that's only within like 5%, right? So the chance that you're going to like do even better than hitting your budget is basically zero. Is maybe not zero. It's like 5% or something, right? So there's actually a much higher likelihood that you will, double, triple your budgeted cost for a construction project. So builders, therefore, are very risk adverse, right? They're dealing with an incredibly risky business, and so they do their best to minimize risk to actually be able to offer a product at a consistent price, right? Obviously, these builders, generally are able to hit their budgets, right? But there's a ton of risk mitigation they have to do to be able to actually meet their budgets. And so innovation is a no-go, right? Like you don't really innovate. Like any innovation has to slot right in and be as low risk as possible. It basically has to fit an existing product, right? So you can't do innovations that really change things a lot. For example, modular building is possible, but it's pretty limited in use. Generally, it's only going to be used in projects where the developer has a good, very broad budget where they could, be double or triple over budget and still be okay, right? So the innovation such as modular building is much less common, and just innovation in general in the industry is much less common because it's so high risk, right? If you add a new innovation into your process and it increases the risk by 10, 30%, that could be actually almost 2x risk increase for you overall. And in the construction industry, obviously, I would say there is a overall conservative nature of the people that are in the business. So there is that as well, but they probably have good reason for it, is what I'm saying as well, is they have good reason to be quite conservative because they've probably grown up doing construction their entire life and probably have a quite keen sense of how risky the construction space is and how you do need to be very conservative to make it work. And so this is all the sum of that. It's just, it has not, the industry has advanced in material science, it has advanced in safety, it has advanced in a lot of areas, right? There's been a ton of advancement in what goes into a house, but the thing is, the processes of actually building it, they don't advance because it's more risky. Like changing a material, as long as it's been proven and it kind of gets slowly moved in, it can work. But changing a process is much more risky. And so they don't tend to change their processes very much at all. And so the processes, again, haven't changed pretty much for the last 200 years. Like the only changes we've had pretty much is like in the United States and Canada, you had the framing styles for construction change, but that's pretty much like one of the very few things as far as processes that have changed over time. Obviously, plumbing, electrical kind of shifts slowly over time, but the actual installation processes and manufacturing processes of putting the entire house together have pretty much not advanced at all within like the last 100 years. So that is when you have advancements in the expectations in building standards, but you don't have an advancement in the actual, like, in the processes that put those into the home, what you get is an increase in cost. So either one thing you have to do is you either have to change, the building code shouldn't be increased in complexity and in expectation, or you need to change your processes so that you can install the new standards in an effective way. Unfortunately, we just hope that people will develop processes, but again, the risk there is so high that very few people do. And obviously people try. There are businesses out there that innovate, but there's very few that have grown. So let's say we look in Canada here, and we look at Mattamy Homes, which is the company that in Ontario makes the most homes each year. They build around 7,000, 8,000 homes every year, likely in this year with the tariffs and economic situation here in Canada. The house production is actually going down quite significantly. But when they were at peak, the last in probably like 2021, 2022, they were building 7,000 to 8,000 homes every year annually, which is certainly good. But if we compare that, for example, to how many cars, let's say like Tesla is building, it's minuscule, right? And let's say a house. Obviously, a house is quite a bit larger, right? Let's say obviously a house is fairly significantly larger. For the sake of comparison, we're going to say in 2013, Tesla was building about 10,000 cars every year. In 2013, which is obviously pretty long ago, they were building 10,000 cars every year, while Mattamy Homes right now is building 7,000 homes. So obviously, Mattamy Homes are larger and more expensive than a car. So you probably got 300,000, but it actually, interestingly, it takes less people. A lot of the costs of the house are actually, a significant portion is permitting and materials, as opposed to a car, which is going to be more the manufacturing costs than the materials. But like if you compare like a housing manufacturer to a car manufacturer, it really shows the discrepancy here in our ability to produce. Like 7,000 homes is annually for the best manufacturer in Canada, is unfortunately not anywhere close to the amount of homes we need to be building to actually meet the demand for housing in Ontario. And that's the biggest manufacturer of homes in all of Canada. The rest of the manufacturers build substantially less. I think the next one down builds like 2,000 homes a year. So none of these have really hit like a a scaled level. None of these builders have hit a scaled level of production at all in their ability to produce and manufacture homes. Like, let's say again, we compare Tesla and a home builder, like the very best home builders. Their manufacturing standard, if Tesla's a 10. Let's say Tesla's a 10. Traditional homes, like traditional construction, is like a 1. Maybe like, the exact construction we've been doing for hundreds of years. Traditional building is a 1. The best manufacturer of homes, like Madame or even more advanced, it would be like a 3, right? So we're a far cry. Like Tesla's over here, traditional is like here, and we're like there, right? We're nowhere close. We need to go all the way over here, right? To be able to actually build affordable housing. So there's that, right? And if you talk to builders in Canada, we often can't build. The cost of housing is actually more than land. So you're actually, let's say you have $1 million home, the land might be, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, in that range, between like $200,000 to $400,000, where the home sits at, $700,000 to $500,000 to build. And depending, even in some areas, it can even be more, right? So you're looking to build a house at somewhere around $600,000 to build a house today. And that's not a big house. That's like a pretty average. It's fairly big, because obviously the average today for a house is large. We don't build small houses anymore. But an average house, today's standard, probably around $600,000 to build, if not more, especially over the last few years. And if you talk to many of these builders, obviously not the big developers that are building thousands of homes like Madame, the smaller ones, they can't build a house. Oftentimes, even now, they're not be able to build a house for less than it's selling. So like around me here in kind of the outer GTA, north side of the GTA, housing around here is usually around $1 million, maybe just slightly more in some areas. And if you actually wanted to build a house in these areas, your cost would actually be only just below $1 million. So these builders, their profits actually aren't that high. Obviously in the developments, like the large developments where they're building hundreds, let's say, 50 to 100 houses in an area, they're obviously going to have a better profit margin, but it's still, I think you'd be surprised that it's less than you would expect their profit margin to be, because of how costs have come up. And so these houses, as the market is starting to drop now, the builders can't actually do a better price for the buyers. So these buyers who have bought these homes, they actually are kind of really screwed, because they've bought the home, it was $1 million, and now, or maybe in some areas there are some spots where it's like 800,000, 900,000. But with all things together, right, it might probably was like 800,000, and then when you add all the stuff you want in your house, probably is going to be $1 million. So now these people, maybe they're in a hard economic spot, and overall the cost of existing housing is starting to go down. Many of the houses around here, the prices are starting to drop. And so you're looking at your house with $1 million that you bought for $1 million that isn't done yet. And you're seeing that similar houses are now at 900,000. And you're like, well, maybe I want to see if I can push the builder to drop the price for me, but it's not happening because he's got to keep you at the original price because he can't afford, because if he gives it to you at 900,000, he's losing all his profit margin or a good portion of it. And oftentimes he just can't do that, right? If it comes down 900, 800,000, he's going to be losing most of his profit margin. And even, unfortunately, I've spent time on some of these builds, and oftentimes there's a lot of these projects have challenges with supply lines and labor, as well as there's a lot of mistakes that happen in big developments like this that lead to cost overruns. And so it's kind of they're taking risks, right? And some of these developments may be really tight because of some mistakes that they made. And even the ones that didn't make any mistakes and put the development together just fine, even they are going to be having a hard time getting a really good profit margin just because of the way that materials and labor has increased in cost. The industry is quite complex, is the point. And really the only way to improve things for affordability in industry is to create a business where we can actually bring some of this stuff together, where we can take, unfortunately, I've, through my own building projects, found how these things can really screw up a project. And so what we really need to do is take a bit more control over these things and get the processes leaned down into a single kind of manufacturing system, like going back to Henry Ford, and see how do we make our own housing assembly line, even a moving assembly line of housing where we can actually build all the walls and put the electrical in and put the plumbing in and get it all in ready to go so that you can just slap the wall up and just go. That, unfortunately, is going to be pretty hard, which is why I haven't jumped straight into it. But I think, to me, that is going to be the biggest factor, is to reduce affordable housing, not even going to the point of getting, an advanced assembly line of, putting everything into these modular units. But if you can at least get the entire system under one roof, which obviously many of these days have, been able to get it all under one roof. Again, this is unfortunately going to take us over here into the next number 2, which is regulation. So number 2 after industry that affects affordability is regulation. And unfortunately, it is as big an issue, if not maybe even bigger, than the industry side, which is the regulation is tremendously complex in housing. So I was reading something where they were saying, I was reading something recently that was talking about how food CEOs, like CEOs from big food companies like Kraft, what are some other ones? Kellogg's, etc. These companies are really against, like, even states, like what they see some of the states or provinces trying to implement their own regulations on what can be in foods and what can't be, and this kind of thing. And they're like, oh, we don't like that at all, right? Like, we're pretty scared of that. We don't like it. Just imagine that every town had different regulations. That's where you're looking at with housing, is not only does each province have its own building code, right? We have the Ontario building code in Ontario, and then each province has their own building code. There's no like Canada building code, right? But then you get into you got the Ontario building code, but the Ontario Building Code was only implemented actually fairly recently. I don't even know if every province has their own like provincial building code, because the building codes are actually really decided by municipalities. Each municipality has their own building standards you have to meet. And while for the most part, now that in Ontario we have the Ontario Building Code, most towns will be a derivative of the Ontario Building Code. Many of them choose not to entirely match the Ontario Building Code, and there's not a full agreement on across Ontario on one single building code, unfortunately, which means as a builder, you actually cannot build one design that meets the standards of every building code. Or I guess you could, I guess you could study every single building code in every town and create like a design. But it means that as a modular builder, you can't just mass produce one kind of unit and then sell it across all Ontario, because it actually has to meet the standards of each area. And they all have different processes, different ways of doing things. So that makes it very complex for one to actually sell housing in anywhere. I imagine the US is probably the same as Canada in this building code situation. Innovation and science in housing is again, it's pretty challenging, but on top of being risky, you also have regulation. So any new material, let's say you want to use a new material or a new process or a new kind of engineering for your house that makes it better to manufacture, easier to manufacture. Maybe we even just want to, implement an electrical system that is easier to install, or you want to not hire expensive licensed electricians. You want to hire cheaper electricians that aren't licensed. Most of these manufacturers end up where they just are building houses in the traditional way, or maybe slightly more advanced, but it's mostly traditional, just under a big roof. Because if they try to change their process too much, it may not be easy to have it approved, right? The easiest thing to do is just have standard tradespeople build the house the normal way they typically do, just inside of a factory or inside of a warehouse, because that meets all the regulatory standards that you have to meet. And if you want to go and do something that is a more advanced manufacturing process with a more scalable engineering solution, you're going to run into a lot of regulatory issues. You're going to run into a lot of challenges, because maybe you can get it approved with the Ontario Building Code. Maybe you can. Like maybe you're able to work with the standards, the Canadian Standards Association, and have that worked into, a standard. But even if you do get it all approved with the CSA and it fits, is approved for meeting the building code, even if you do all that, each town can decide whether or not they want to use your product. And many of them are very conservative and will choose not to. So just the regulatory issues are just extraneous. It's just exceptionally extensive. And for example, Boxable, I was watching a video about the guy. Maybe he was the owner, or maybe he's the project manager. He was being interviewed about Boxable's situation, and some people were criticizing him. I saw in their comments, because he's basically blaming regulatory issues, over-regulation. And unfortunately, if you actually do your research and understand the situation of regulation in the housing space across North America, it is way too overregulated, especially if you're someone like Boxable who's trying to do something that's a bit more advanced, right? They're trying to use more advanced materials. They're trying to have a more advanced process of assembly that is none of it is standard at all, right? The way Boxable does things is not standard at all. And so for them, especially with an advanced way of putting things together and an advanced material set, is just a recipe to go up against just regulatory approvals galore, right? The amount of money you're going to have to put into paying for all these approvals for standard and safety and all these tests and all this stuff. And then even after you do all the tests, you're going to have to get approved with each town that you're doing a project in. So let's say someone comes to you and it's like, hey, great, you got all this engineering figured out, you got this all figured out, or I want to use your product for this building in some town in, I don't know, let's say Texas or Ohio, whatever, right? And you're like, okay, cool, we'll do that. Well, they now need to get it approved with their local town, and their local town has every right to just decide not to approve it. And so for a lot of customers, it's just like, well, why would I choose to use your product if I have to go through this whole process with my town, and at the end of the day, they might just disapprove and then I won't be able to use it. So it's just a ton of money that you've already spent to get all these approvals for the engineering and for the tests and all this stuff. And then you find out that there's a lot of towns that won't even allow your product to be used. That's pretty unfortunate, right? So generally, I personally obviously wouldn't take a perspective of like, hey, let's build a business where we have advanced materials and advanced processes and then try to sell to the general housing industry. I personally think that's kind of a recipe for disaster for the reasons that I just mentioned. So personally, for my business, obviously I'm looking at a process where we build for an adjacent industry to housing, where we're looking at RVs, mobile homes, these kind of spaces where the regulations are more flexible, where you can kind of you can use these in contexts where they don't have to meet as extensive regulations, and you maybe not even need a building permit. Not to replace housing, because the main thing we need to do is figure out the regulation, right? The regulation is going to take, it can be figured out. It's going to take time, right? It's going to take time and money and lobbying, etc., to figure it out. And I think if we start a movement, if you start a movement, there's already movements going to push this stuff along. And I think it will be pushed along as the issue becomes larger and larger. It will become something that people have to figure out. But so in the meantime, we need to look at how do we build modular housing and get ready for when the regulation is ready. And so to me, it's like, okay, how do we build a product, build housing that is modular housing, and manufacture it in a kind of in mass scaled production and sell to an adjacent market. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to basically, my goal is to build basically like resorts that are like tiny resorts where we're selling a hotel suite or like a resort suite that's on that's mobile, that's a modular unit. So you could just buy it, place it on a piece of land. Canada actually has a lot of land that is just totally unused. And so in addition with making these suites, these mobile suites, we also create a system where we can do them off grid. So we don't have to provide services from a town there. So we can find locations. They don't have a lot of areas that don't have town services. Ontario is enormous, and there's a lot of areas that are underdeveloped. And so these areas are perfect locations where you're going to be able to get cheap land, and you're going to be able to have potentially even some really nice scenery around that people would want to see. And then you have an off-grid system so you can run all of it. And I hit my mic again. Personally, I think it's a massive opportunity is in this space of underdeveloped land where we can develop it with mobile units and use them for basically short-term rentals, vacation rentals, shorter term stays, so that we don't have to actually have it like a permitted dwelling. And in the future, maybe we can have, long-term living solutions, but I think that sits in the future. Now, where did I go with this? Anyway, regulation. So those are kind of regulation is a pain, and then personally my solutions that I think are some real solutions for building in this space to get ready for when regulation changes. Overall, though, I would say regulation, this is a big issue, but it's also like a fixable issue, because most towns, most of the most important towns that you might want to do these cool new developments in, a lot of them are actually fairly small, right? So you might have a town that's like 20,000 people, 10,000 people. Here in Canada, some of them are even as low as like 5,000 population. So you could absolutely move into these areas and have regulations changed pretty smoothly or pretty easily. You don't have to change that many minds in each town. When you've got a population of only 10,000 people, you really only have to change like 10 people's mind, or maybe 100, somewhere between like maybe 110 and 100. You only really need to change a few minds in the area to actually have the regulation changed in that area. So I think a lot of people get spooked when they are like, I want to do a project here, and how do I do a project? Oh, they've got a regulation that says I can't do it, or maybe they don't have any regulation at all specific to what you're doing, and so you go, oh, I guess it's not allowed, right? But don't let yourself go, oh, well, it's not allowed. Instead, look at, okay, how can I do this? And even if it's, let's say you're wanting to do a fairly large project, you should really talk to the community. If there's only a lot of these communities, again, very small, you could talk to the community, give your reasoning why it would be a good idea, and you could potentially move toward an approval. But don't be disheartened, because these things can change, especially municipalities. Like in a municipality, even a fairly large municipality, just a few complaints, just like 3 or 4 or 5 complaints to a municipality can get a regulation changed surprisingly quick. And obviously this doesn't happen just like that, right? Like there's obviously a process that gets voted on, etc. But that process can often start just because of like 1 or 2 complaints, right? So you really do need to consider that you actually have a lot of power when it comes to municipalities. You have a lot of power as a homeowner or resident within a municipality, and don't get, don't just surrender immediately. And, if it's one municipality that doesn't work out, again, there's lots of municipalities and lots of small ones. I think in Ontario, there's like 356 municipalities in Ontario. So if it doesn't work out in your municipality, move somewhere else. There's 356. Your chance that all 356 are going to say, no, we don't like the project you're doing is pretty slim. obviously, if you have some kind of crazy project, then maybe it's a bad idea. But if your project is reasonable, then you could probably find a spot where it works, right? So don't get a no from someone and go and just surrender, right? If you want to have a tiny house or a garden suite or another kind of development put somewhere, and you look and you're like, well, I can't do this tiny house in my town. Well, then, there's other towns. Get looking, get calling. And again, if you're, let's say you live already in that town, you own property there, and you call the town and you talk to the office, right? Talk to the mayor, like talk to the councilors, talk to the mayor, talk to the actual decision makers at the town, because the office is going to tell you just the rule, right? They're just going to look in their book and they'll be like, well, my book says this rule is the rule, so this is what it is, right? But the actual councilor or the mayor will be able to give you, what is the chance that this could be possible, right? Okay, maybe there's not a rule against this, but we are going to allow it, right? Like the person in the office might say, well, there's not a rule that says you can do it, so we're just going to assume that you can't. Whereas the mayor's going to be like, well, there's no rule, so, let's talk about it. Let's have a look at it and figure out how we can make this work. They're much more likely at the councilors or the mayor to actually kind of work out the issue with you, rather than the office that might just go, the staff at the town that might just go like, you can't do it. Nothing I can help you with. So again, those are some key ones. We are at an hour on this podcast. I actually want to go into this topic of town, location, local regulation in more depth. And I would like to have at my business a database where you can see like which towns allow you to add a garden suite or a tiny home, or allow you to do Airbnb businesses. Because, for example, let's say you're looking in Muskoka, right? Because Muskoka is a great place to have an Airbnb. All the lakes, cottage country, there's a lot of demand there. You could go to like Gravenhurst, and if I remember correctly, Gravenhurst, or maybe it was Bracebridge. There's a lot of towns that actually make up Muskoka, right? You've got Kawartha, Gravenhurst, Bracebridge, Haliburton, and others that aren't coming to mind. But let's say, Bracebridge says, no, we are strict about short-term rentals. We are strict about tiny homes. We are strict about garden suites. None of those are good for us. We don't like any of those. And so we're not going to do your housing project. Go to Haliburton. From my experience, Haliburton is very good about it, right? And maybe even Gravenhurst. I don't know too well if Gravenhurst is, but you should go to each town in the area that you're looking at, and don't just because one town says they don't allow something doesn't mean all the towns do. Again, I think a lot of people today don't understand the full levels of the government in North America, where you have federal, and federal does certain kind of things, and you have provincial, and they do a certain kind of things, and you have municipalities, and they do a certain level of stuff, right? Where municipalities are doing your roads, they're regulating housing, they're regulating, building infrastructure on a commercial, residential, kind of local level. The provincial, they actually, some people kind of might think of them as doing roads as well and doing infrastructure, but they actually do a lot less infrastructure and roads than you think, right? Like any of the local, obviously, for us, the province handles big construction projects, big transport projects. Highways are OPP, they're provincial. Larger transport projects are provincial, but like 90% of the roads are municipal, right? And 90% of housing, if not maybe 99%, is going to be municipal. The province really, as far as infrastructure, actually fairly limited, and as well as transport fairly limited. So the province for us really handles mainly healthcare, highways, and like infrastructure projects like bridges and stuff like that, right? Which mostly handle, bridges over rivers that are related to highways, bridges over highways, over the cross highways, that kind of stuff, right? They actually have a less impact in your local community than you think, right? So a surprising amount of the stuff that you deal with governmentally is actually municipal. A lot of it relating especially to housing and to communities and to this immediate services that you deal with are often actually municipal related. And so if you don't understand provincial, like federal, provincial, municipal, then I ask you to please look into how this works, and also look into like, okay, how do municipalities vary in regulation, right? Like if, my town has these regulations, well, what about another town, right? Maybe you just assumed there was something normal in your town that is a regulation, and like, is that normal across all towns? Well, it may be, it may not be, right? So don't be quick to assume that it is. Again, I encourage you to actually understand the government, how this runs. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people assume that the federal government has a lot of effect on them, and the government, as far as I can tell, the federal government actually has the least impact on you on a day-to-day basis than any of the other governments actually do, which is just kind of interesting when you think about it, because they really just handle military and intergovernmental negotiations, international matters, obviously. With this regulation issue, I really encourage you to understand what the levels of government do, and how they actually affect you, and how, if you care about housing, how is that affecting housing, right? Because the province actually has very little effect on housing. It really isn't their issue, and it's not even really the provincial issue. So who you elect provincially, who you elect federally, actually has very little impact on the housing crisis. Is really what matters for the housing crisis is the municipalities. That is actually what really matters. And so if you want to actually have an impact in the housing space, you're going to want to talk to your municipalities. You're going to want to actually have a community effect, a community oriented movement around the municipalities, not so much around the province. Because even here in Ontario, they mandated that the towns have to allow ADUs, additional dwelling units, on houses, right? So they kind of said, like, towns, you guys aren't approving additional dwelling units as much as we think you should, so we're going to make a rule that says you have to. And so, yeah, they made that rule. But the thing is, the rollout for that rule is tremendously slow, and it's probably going to continue to roll out quite slowly over the next few years. So if you want to wait a few years for ADUs, then I guess that's okay. But it's really a local, housing is really a local issue. So I think that is all the topics I wanted to cover today. So thank you for tuning in to this podcast called OneX, and I look forward to doing the next episode and talking about some more interesting topics around housing, design, and business. Maybe we'll get into some more business next time. Maybe we'll have a guest next time. I welcome you to subscribe to the podcast and check me out on Instagram, I guess. My Instagram is monx.design. Thank you for listening. That is all.